Welcome, everyone. It's almost time to start our 48th Web Debate. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces, and we will just get underway in a second or two. So, welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to very warmly welcome you to our 48th Web Debate. We organize these debates once a month in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training, and we discuss new and emerging issues in the practice of diplomacy. And I think the debate today could not be more timely. The topic for today is virtual and hybrid diplomacy. What have we learned? And over the last year, we've seen a tremendous challenge posed to diplomatic practitioners. On the one hand, they needed to solve the crisis situation related to the COVID-19 pandemic. On the other hand, they also needed to figure out how to communicate, how to practice diplomacy as they could not meet in person and as they had to find other ways, digital ways of meeting, of negotiating. So to dive deeper into this topic, we have two fantastic speakers, and I'm really happy to welcome them to this debate. So let me very briefly introduce them. We have with us Professor Cornelio Bjoila. He's an associate professor of diplomatic studies at the University of Oxford, and he is the head of the Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group. As many of you will know, he has published extensively on issues related to the impact of digital technology on the conduct of diplomacy. His books include Digital Diplomacy Theory and Practice from 2015 and Digital Diplomacy and International Organizations, Autonomy, Legitimacy and Contestation from last year. And he told me that he is currently working on a co-edited volume on digital international relations. Welcome, Cornelio. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Our second speaker for today is Dr. Ilan Manor. He's a digital diplomacy scholar at Tel Aviv University, and he's also a member of the Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group. His book, called The Digitalization of Public Diplomacy, was published in 2019. And last year, in 2020, his co-edited volume, Public Diplomacy and the Politics of Uncertainty, was published. Ilan, it's great to have you here. Before I start asking questions to our excellent speakers, I would like to remind you, our audience, that we're trying to make this debate as interactive as possible. This means we're looking for your questions and comments, and in fact, we depend on them for this debate to be as interactive, but also as interesting and as in-depth as possible. If you're joining us in Zoom, you can leave the comments and questions here in Zoom. If you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, you can leave your comments there. In order to kind of create an overview and have a grasp on all the comments and questions that are coming in, of course, I have help. In this case, it's my colleague Pavlina Ittelson from Diplo Foundation's US office. I think I've said enough in terms of preliminaries, so I would really like to get into the debate. And so my first question goes to Ilan, actually, and it's a kind of a scoping question. I know you and Cornelio have done quite some research on this particular topic, how diplomatic practice has changed, has adapted over the last year. So basically, that's the question. How, in your observations, in your research, has diplomatic practice changed or adapted over the last year? And perhaps can you highlight some of your findings from this research that you've been doing, and perhaps already some best practices that you've been observing?
Good afternoon, everyone. And I just wanted to start by thanking Catherine for bringing us together for this really important and relevant discussion. Me and Cornelio recently had a Zoom chat in which we felt it's important to distinguish between digital adaptation and digital adoption. So adaptation is a forced process in which offline events necessitate that diplomats adopt new technologies. Digital adoption, on the other hand, is a voluntary process in which diplomats and foreign ministries decide to use certain digital technologies to obtain specific goals. And Zoom for remote training, while still others created shared command and control centers that brought together foreign ministries with health ministries, tourism, and finance ministries. At Oxford, we recently analyzed a questionnaire that we sent to more than 100 diplomats during the COVID outbreak, in which diplomats were forced to adapt to a new situation, social isolation and quarantines. And our results indicate that diplomats view video conferencing, such as what we're doing now, as an effective alternative to face-to-face diplomacy. Diplomats stated that they could read a virtual room thanks to video cameras and the chat application, that offline negotiations could migrate online, and that groups of diplomats who had collaborated offline could also work together online. Diplomats in multilateral hubs, such as Geneva or New York, stated that Zoom really saves time and enables diplomats to attend more meetings. However, the diplomats also noted certain limitations. For instance, it's harder to build trust via Zoom, and so negotiations that begin offline can migrate online, but you can't start sensitive negotiations online. Diplomats also stated that a high number of meetings per day leads to what they called Zoom fatigue. And this was a term used by many diplomats. They actually said Zoom fatigue reduces the efficacy of diplomatic meetings. And finally, diplomats stated that corridor talks, hallway discussions, which are essential for promoting shared policies, can take place in video conferencing. So as an overall answer, I would say that hybrid diplomacy will probably augment face-to-face diplomacy, but will never replace it. Thus far, I've discussed digital adaptation, but in terms of a digital adoption or COVID's digital legacy, I think we will see three processes. First, diplomatic institutions will create their own video conferencing tools that allow them to debate sensitive topics. Diplomats in our survey said that Zoom is not a secure platform, so they can't talk about sensitive topics. Also, we'll probably see in multilateral institutions a mix of hybrid diplomacy where negotiations will start offline and then migrate online. Second, we are likely to see the automation of consular aid as foreign ministries use technologies to gather data on citizens in need of aid. The Lithuanian Foreign Ministry created a chatbot during COVID, allowing the relatively small ministry to focus its efforts on offline consular assistance, and I think that others will follow in their footsteps. And finally, I think that we're going to start to witness diplomats using predictive modeling as part of consular affairs. Predictive modeling can help diplomats map the possible progression of a pandemic and therefore prioritize consular aid to different countries. So this is my overview in the beginning.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting. And I think this distinction between adaptation and adoption is a really important one, especially we've seen this kind of crisis reaction with digital tools where they're to fill a gap that was created by not being able to meet face to face. At the same time, the question, as you highlighted, is how do these things then become more permanent? How are they going to have a longer term impact on the practice of diplomacy? And I mean, everyone here in the room, I think, is very positive in that regard, that some of these practices that have been developed as a crisis reaction should become more permanent, should become a more established feature of diplomatic practice. As I said, we're trying to make this debate as interactive as possible. So I want to turn again to the audience, because we have a question for you where we want to kind of harness your wisdom and your experience. For this, we're going to use Menti, which is an online survey tool. You can see on the screen what we are basically doing. You can go to menti.com and type in the code 59078342, and then you will be taken to this survey. And basically the question we are asking: what skills do diplomats need for virtual and hybrid diplomacy? Or basically, what skills do diplomats need now for virtual and hybrid diplomacy to flourish? Here we give you an option to put in a couple of words. So please do so. We will come back to this a little bit later and then look at the kind of responses and the kind of comments and basically words and we received. And bring this back into the discussion. So I will continue the discussion with Cornelio and Ilan for a little bit, but while we're talking, please also kind of multitask and go to menti.com and kind of give us your impressions. We already have two: flexibility and adaptation. When we come back to this, I'm going to be very curious to see what other keywords we're getting. So, Cornelio, let me turn to you for a bit of a future casting exercise, perhaps. So we heard from Ilan an overview of the kind of practices that have developed, and we heard some hints about what things might have a longer term impact. I want to ask you two things. First, we've been using this term hybrid diplomacy. Can you give us a sense of, from your perspective, of course, what we mean by hybrid diplomacy? And then also, again, kind of where do you see the longer term influences of the kinds of examples Ilan just touched upon?
All right. Thank you very much, Katerina, for organizing the event, also for the question. And it's a timely discussion. We try at the moment, not only us, the academics, but also Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to reassess and regroup. Exactly after this external shock that we've seen in the pandemic, people trying to move online on Zoom, and it's a new medium, and has become, the business of, it's another day for diplomats to stay online. If a few years ago it was a little bit, extraordinary to do this, now it has become part of the daily practice for many, including the diplomats. Now, what do we mean by hybrid here? Hybrid is an interesting term because it speaks about, the merging of two concepts. So what are the two concepts in this case? Is the face-to-face, the physical interaction that diplomats have been practicing for a long time. This is how it started, right? Face-to-face physical interaction. The other element is what we do right now. It's a virtual engagement. And I appreciate, the interactivity element that you actually brought into the discussions from Menti and others. So there is a question about what extent these two things can be put together, in what conditions. So we ask exactly a question about this. What is the long-term impact of the virtual on the diplomatic practice? To what extent this kind of convergence or merging is it possible? And what we found interesting in our responses and the responses in our survey is that about 40% of the people, which is a high number, 40% of the people responded are yet to make up their mind. What do they see? They adopted a wait and see policy, wait and see to see certain things, how it's going to evolve. There is a perception that, for instance, the virtual is seen as a necessity, but they're unsure about the long-term influence of VR, and it's too soon to be. These are what 40% of the people seems to express. And then we say, well, why so? What exactly are the things that we like to? And they pointed out certain issues. So what they like is that the networking possibilities. Now you can connect with many people. The quality of the network is different than face-to-face, but you are able to engage with many people at the same time. There's also the fact that it's very time effective. For many, they were able, some of the diplomates were able to attend 3 meetings the same day, one in New York, UN, one in Geneva, and the other one in Paris. This is something that they want to keep, to be able to connect with others. There is a nagging concern about the security aspect, which you, Lilan, already mentioned. So there is something about how to go around the problem of confidentiality. What also we found interesting is that there is this question that comes up about visibility, which is interesting. In virtual, you are visible. But diplomacy is a visual practice in the sense that you travel, that you engage with people, that there are pictures of you shaking hands, and physical hands. There's this kind of interaction, that you spend more time with this leader comparing with others. In the digital, this is a bit constrained. We are all little squares on the screen. So there is this kind of element that, the visibility, despite the visual medium, right? The visibility of the practice of diplomacy, all the ceremonial, all the protocol, all the engagement that comes with that, it's a little the symbolic nature of that, it's a bit lost. So this is why we thought, okay, so what does it mean, in terms of hybridity, of the merging? And they identify 3 layers that needs to make in order for this hybrid diplomacy to work. One is a basic one, technical. And technical, it's question on security, but also on connectivity. Connectivity we take for granted, right? Some of the actors are better, but it's not necessarily an easy thing. UN meetings have been plagued by the problem of connectivity because some countries, especially in some of the countries in the global south, were problems of connecting. So it's something important, and There's the question of interactivity, to what extent this kind of medium may facilitate. And this is where probably, why Zoom is very good in providing all kinds of features. Going for a bespoke solution might be complicated because you need to be good at creating this kind of technical advantages. So one layer that can actually help with this is a basic one, it's technical. But there is a second one. The second one is about the external environment. Let's remember the social media. People started to migrate, Ministry of Foreign Affairs started to migrate online because this is where the public was. But I think it's important here to understand that what happens after the pandemic, how many countries will continue to use this? In the sense, the ecosystem has to be enough, a critical mass of people still continuing to do this. There's a concern, a slight concern that, my people might return to the face-to-face, and then, the traction of using may decline. So we'll move more internally, right? Internally in terms of communication with embassies, communicating with people inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the third layer, which I found that the most interesting, is the institutional dimension. Let's remember, with the social media, we have this kind of stars that we've seen the diplomatic, like Tom Fletcher, right, or John Castle. They rise in terms of prominence because they were very good at how they adopted digital and social media to their work. I think there is a concern here, who are the new stars in the virtual media who are able to use this kind of hybridity quite effectively for diplomats, because that gives you status, that gives you inside the ministry, but also with your peers. So do we have signs of this kind of mutation? To a certain extent, the people in our survey emphasize that the protocol is less important. That also there is a slight interesting gender dynamic in which women are better at engaging online. They pay more attention to the non-verbal communication aspect. They read the room slightly better. So there is an interesting element when we look at this kind of how these practices online can transfer offline, how the new status that is created in the virtual medium can enhance the stature and can create a critical mass of support that can actually enhance the value. So the hybridity aspect is not about everything moving online. It's not going to happen. It's just about being selective. In which areas do we need to go virtual? So there is this area of internal management, especially, they find it quite effective. And also to what extent in the policy aspect or public diplomacy, in which how this kind of elements can be put together. So this is where we say we are now in this kind of intermezzo between adaptation, when we are forced to look at the issue and adapt, and adoption. We are intermezzo in this kind of in-between, in which we try to reassess and regroup what works and in what areas this can be more fruitful. But I can get back to that a bit later.
Thank you. I listened to these three dimensions with a lot of interest. What comes to my mind, and you kind of touched upon this, is the question of protocol and rules of procedure. Because in the beginning, you said that most respondents to your survey kind of weren't quite sure what to make of this new world of additional tools, of more virtual interaction, kind of wait and see. And so I'm wondering whether or not this also has to do basically with the question that rules of procedure need to be adapted or changed one way or another, as well as protocol questions. But you also said protocol seems to be less of a concern, at least to the people to the diplomats in your survey. So I found that really interesting. Do you quickly want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised as well. I thought that the protocol might be important, especially in the context when you have this kind of multilateral settings. And I think we invited people, that participated in both bilateral and multilateral settings. There was an emphasis on the quality of moderation, no question about it, because they wanted to keep the meeting short, but that's not necessarily related to protocol per se. It was because protocol means, who has the right to speak first, what is the order, to what extent seniors, have more sway in the way. But there's a little bit of that. But what they thought is that the quality of the moderation was a critical factor, and the moderation meaning, keeping, sticking to the agenda, and critically being inclusive, right? So in a sense, there is a tension here with the protocol, being inclusive, listening, bringing people on board, So that's something that they thought that this is considered to be a successful meeting, right? In which, it clashes, and it normal. I think I find that natural. It's a medium, this kind of virtual that levels, right? We are all squares on a screen. Right? It's not we are all squares on the screen. So in a sense, from this point of view, our status is quite leveled. So the medium, in sense, creates this kind of predisposition for being able to participate and engage. And these were the elements that we found in the survey quite interesting. Being able to bring people on board online was considered to be an element of success.
Thank you. Just a small note. We have a lot of questions and comments coming in, so I'm going to turn to my colleague Pavlina shortly. Just one comment that for me stood out, or I just want to pass it on to you, Cornelio. Andre Aprigio says, "I'd love to have Professor Bjola as my PhD supervisor." So I guess you've got a new job there, in addition to all the other things you're doing. But over to Pavlina. What kind of questions and comments have you seen so far? I think there are quite a number, so it's going to be a challenge, but I think you're up to it.
Yes, there's quite a number of questions. However, the topic of the question seems to evolve around the same issue. So we have a question from Gary Diaz-Bartolome, who noted that digitalization transcended the public diplomacy field and finally reached the realm of traditional diplomacy in both bilateral and multilateral spheres. And then he asks, what do you think about the exclusivity of digital diplomacy as never seen before due to COVID? And will it give in a bit when blending the hybrid format of the future? We have a lot of input on participation in online meetings. So one commenter said, are there any characteristics of hybrid meetings that affect balanced presence, both positive and negative, physical attributes, voices, other positive changes for those who are uncomfortable with the lack of control in physical meetings? And then Mulut Khalif extended on this question and asked, how do we make sure that those who are online do not feel excluded from the dynamic, visual clues, corridor, and such, of the negotiation and discussion face-to-face? So I'll give the word to the panelists, and then I have 2 more questions after that.
Okay, thank you. Really interesting questions. So thanks for everyone who added questions and comments. So yeah, without further ado, I would be really interested to hear the reactions from our panelists. Ilan, would you start us off with any reactions, any comments on those questions?
Yeah, well, the first comment about digitalization of diplomacy finally escaping the realm of public diplomacy, I think that this has been a long-term process, but we just haven't always noticed it. It really came to the fore during COVID, because at once all meetings moved online and there was a lot of publicity around it. But in the past few years, the digital technologies have been integrated into consular diplomacy, they have been integrated into diaspora diplomacy, they have been integrated into negotiations. Foreign ministries now use big data analysis, create their own algorithms, have begun to experiment with artificial intelligence. So digitalization has already escaped the realm of public diplomacy. I think now it's just more visible because of the crisis. Looking towards the future, I think that there are 2 possible impediments to hybrid diplomacy flourishing. And one of them is generational gaps. And we know from experience from the past 12 years that younger diplomats find it easier to adopt new technologies and to integrate them into their daily activities. Hybrid diplomacy will necessitate that also senior and older diplomats also embrace new technologies such as video conferencing. And I think that here foreign ministry training may prove especially useful. So ambassadors, director generals, the highest echelons of foreign ministries must undergo dedicated training that meets their specific needs and their existing technological abilities. Second important possible impediment is institutional mentalities. So we know that there are certain foreign ministries who are risk tolerant, for instance, the UK Foreign Office. And we know that there are some foreign ministries that are risk averse, such as Japan or Switzerland. And I think that those foreign ministries that are more risk tolerant will find it easier to adopt hybrid diplomacy, because it's always a process of trial and error. And the more diplomats experiment with these technologies, the more they'll be able to identify where they offer an added value and when they can best be used. Finally, I would say that multilateral institutions may play a very important role here. Because if the United Nations or the OSCE adopts a certain technology, for instance, a certain video conferencing system, it will force all member states to adopt the same technology. And this will almost lead to standardization across countries in using these technologies. And that will enable poorer countries and richer countries to meet on a level playing ground.
Thank you. So straight over to Cornelio.
No, just to build on what Ilan said, I think it's a fascinating. The question, I very much like the question about public diplomacy, how the virtual changes the context and of how public diplomacy is conducted. Why do I say so? So when you think about diplomacy, we think about three key core functions: the function of representation, the function of communication, the function of negotiation. So social media has been particularly good on the communication part, right? Because you can do a lot of stuff, so Facebook, Twitter, you can present your positions, you can frame narratives, and so on and so forth. What I think with the virtual, where it's going, and I think it's a little bit unexplored, it's the representation part. Just think about it, right? So it's live representation in the sense that you, as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, this is how people get in touch with you. This is how people interact and they learn about you. So we've seen a little bit of that emerging, what they call digital visits, when other Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because they were unable to meet face-to-face, organizing digital visits for other people. But just think about it. If you continue with this practice, and not only for other diplomats, but digital visits for the larger public, when you introduce, in a sense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the embassies to certain topics that you do, so this kind of virtual environment. So I think there is something positive to learn from this. I've attended by accident. There was a reception, right? Virtual reception organized by the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, during a reception. And it's great in a sense, because they have to put thinking. What do they want these people to learn during that reception? You have to keep them engaged. So there is a very fertile ground, I think, for public diplomacy in which you actually don't only present clips, but actually engage and interact with some people in the area of public diplomacy. So it's more to be done. So digital visits, it's a trend, and I was happy to hear that some of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs want to keep them going. But I think it can be expanded, and you can see, groups, that you target traditionally with the social media. Now you may want to open that up and to convert that, for digital meetings with NGOs, with different groups that you are interested in. But it's something to think about that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to actually go straight over to Pavlina for any more questions and comments that we received.
Second, we have more, definitely. So another discussion which was in the chat was about recommending another word instead of virtual. The participants fear it's imbued of misleading accents of unreal, while it's digitally inflowed, absolutely real and something else. And then I have two more questions. A lot of participants were asking about least developed countries and their participation in virtual diplomacy. Other differences in responses along a large state compared to small state perspective. How do developing and LDC countries adapt to digital diplomacy so that they are not left behind? And the third one is leveraging the digital and social media. Does it erase the hierarchical order of communications? Do you feel this can be a case moving forward? involving Twitter, especially with respect to banning certain politicians off the platforms or banning the platforms like in Nigeria altogether within the country. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pavlina. And again, thank you so much for your questions and comments. So on the question of virtual, if this is a misleading term, maybe we can open this up to a general question on terminology, I think, which is always a struggle we are facing when we talk about digitalization, digital issues, cyber. There's a lot of terminology floating around. So maybe you can let Ilan and Cornelia, maybe you can kind of give us hints on your thinking and how you use these terms, or for this case in particular, how you started using this terminology. And just to underscore, I'm also really interested in the question of small and developing countries and whether or not this kind of, I'm going to call it increasing digitalization or increasing virtualization of diplomatic practice, whether or not this is also equaling the playing field if we can have that kind of hope. Let's go in the same order. Ilan, over to you for some comments and insights, and then Cornelio.
Yeah, thank you. Really terrific set of questions here. The term virtual is an interesting one. And in our questionnaire, something that was very important to diplomats to stress is that while video conferencing can enable you to meet during social isolation and during pandemics, there is the limitation of being able to sense other diplomats, being able to sense a room. And we know that being able to sense hierarchies within a negotiating room, being able to sense authority in a negotiating room is crucial to diplomatic processes. And I actually think that the next wave of digital technologies that will soon begin to impact diplomacy and the world may facilitate this, whether we're talking about augmented reality and virtual reality, which some of our respondents said that, could you create virtual environments in which diplomats, they know that they're interacting online, but they can almost get a sense of one another. And some even spoke of holograms, which some people believe by 2028 will be an integral part of our office. And this is a way of overcoming this screen barrier and the small pixels that Cornelio was talking about. I don't know necessarily if we'll adopt a different word from virtual, but I do feel that the word hybrid diplomacy tries to overcome this limitation of the word virtual. It says that hybrid is when the online and the offline worlds collide and come together to create something new. The second question about small countries, I think it's important to remember that we've seen this throughout the digitalization of diplomacy, that sometimes small actors are in fact the leaders, and they are the first to adopt new technologies. So already in 2014, the Kenyan Foreign Ministry used Twitter to evacuate its citizens from South Sudan. And this was long before the UK and Germany and France and the US were using Twitter for consular affairs. Kosovo, one of the smallest foreign ministries in the world, a relatively small country. But if you look at their offline connections, they're probably the best connected foreign ministry online. So sometimes small countries actually wish to leverage digital technologies. They're even more eager to leverage digital technologies than big and dominant powers. And I think that hybrid diplomacy will actually be very good for smaller or poorer countries because they have limited representation abroad, and through virtual or augmented meetings, they'll be able to participate in deliberations in the UN, in deliberations in Geneva, and deliberations in Rome without ever leaving their office. So this will actually be a very big benefit for the smaller countries with smaller diplomatic corps, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether we're looking at poorer countries in the developing world. So I definitely think that this is going to have a leveling effect that is going to be most useful for the smaller countries.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Just to add to this, I think I really love the question about terminology. I may sound, this is nerdy, but it's an academic, definition and concepts and stuff. But why do I say so? Because it feels like it's a new beginning. We are in a good place. I remember in 2013, 2014, when the discussion about digital diplomacy started to discuss. And if you go back to that point, you see that there was similar concerns. Shall we call it e-diplomacy? Shall we call it the digitization of diplomacy? Shall we call it? And there was, and each definition comes with different understandings, right? The e-diplomacy, it was at the beginning, but it was like email, I don't know, people couldn't get a sense of clearly what. Digitization speaks a little bit more about the technical aspect of transferring things into data, 1, 0. So when we, at that time when we published the first volume of digital diplomacy, we intentionally chose digital diplomacy because it speaks about the qualitative difference of diplomacy, right? There is a digital layer that interferes with the way in which it's done, and is not only technical. And we've seen that it's not technical. Attitudes change, practices change. So it's not only about putting things in a digital format. And we are now in a similar place. Discussion about, is it virtual? I would hate to end up with virtualization of diplomacy, which is, it is not good. But I understand where the concern for the virtual comes from. So in our survey, we actually come across some of the responses saying what Ilan says about the virtual medium in terms of, immersive diplomacy, immersive real virtual element. And we found that it is a generational thing. People under 25 are thinking about that. So it was not very widespread, but there's something that we see, new generation more exposed to games, online games, and all kinds of things. There is something to build, but probably it's not the main priority at the moment. What I find with the term hybrid, I think it encapsulates these two elements and leaves the door open for possible developments in the non-physical component of whether it's Zoom, whether it's more immersive. This is something, and I think we should not overlook this. I think the next step that we're going to see, especially tying back to the question of representation that I mentioned before, the digital consulate. It's around the corner. It's around the corner. Why so? Because, why do we need to go to the consulate anymore if you can get a lot of stuff, done online, and you need, to have some virtual meetings with the consulate. Some of the people already doing that. There is concern. It reduces cost. It's a low-hanging fruit for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I think that will be probably one layer at the consular affairs when you see this kind of hybridity actually striking very hard in the sense that, the virtual will become more present. Virtual embassies, well, we have sort of, in the United States, in Iran, Israel with former, but these are very rudimentary elements. But I can imagine a moment when actually I can visit, a place at some point. So there is this kind of representation, the virtual element that you may see developing. But we shouldn't think only on this kind of spectrum from physical to virtual. I think the question that we need to look at is, especially in the question of hybridity, is what do you plan to achieve? What do you want to do? Let's think, for instance, about what happens nowadays. People want to go and travel abroad. So how, if you are Ministry of Foreign Affairs, what do you do about this? So you can go on social media. Hey, these are the conditions for travel. You run a campaign, you communicate, you disseminate information. So social media is a perfect tool for this. You don't need to go and be extravagant about virtual. But on the other hand, you may want to coordinate your travel plans with other governments, right? You are UK, you want to coordinate your plans with EU. You don't need to travel. There is a place for virtual communication. This is a place where actually coordination of action, having some meetings, okay, how to make sure that, our citizens can go to that place. And I think there is also a layer for face-to-face in the same example. Because if you want to send a clear signal, right, nowadays, you do it face-to-face. So face-to-face emerging as a high-cost meeting, right? If you do it, on Zoom, you say, well, yeah. But if you want to really send the signal, this is where I visit someone in person. So face-to-face has become that kind of premium form of engagement by which a signal can be. These people are really serious. It's, they do something together. So if the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Dominic Raab travels to Brussels, they say, hey, we're going to do this kind of plan. It sends a clear signal that. So I think it's more about, when you think about what do you want to accomplish and what kind of instruments can serve better the different elements of that objective. Communication, social media, coordination, especially Zoom, you want to do something, send a better signal, then face-to-face may also work pretty well in this context. So that's hybrid, in which you select and use different things to accomplish a particular goal.
Thank you. I think this is an extremely useful framework under the umbrella of the term hybrid diplomacy, as in picking and choosing the tools for a given task or for wanting to achieve a certain goal or send a message for a certain kind of symbolism. I think this is really, really interesting, and it's going to be even more interesting over the next couple of months and years to really tease that out, how the practice is developing along these lines. What I want to do now, because we don't have that much time, we have about 5 minutes left, which is really nothing given all the different threads of the discussion. What I want to do is have a look again at the responses we received from you, and invite then our speakers to comment on that and maybe give us a final word. So we asked specifically about the skills that are needed for virtual and hybrid diplomacy. So the skills diplomats need to have or need to develop. And what we see, what I see is, interestingly, it's social skills that seem to be at the forefront. So we have flexibility, adaptability, and collaboration, which are interpersonal skills and skills, in my view, that would be high on the list of desirable skills for diplomats anyway, whether hybrid, virtual, or face-to-face. I also see a couple of comments about technical knowledge, technical know-how, networking skills, but also questions around stable internet connectivity. I'm going to leave this up here for just 1 or 2 more seconds. But basically, Ilan and Cornelia, I would like to invite you to share a final word with us, and perhaps also quickly comment on what we see here, if this is in line with what you would have expected or what you found in your research. So let's start with Ilan, and then very final word from Cornelia.
Flexibility and adaptability are what you'd expect from diplomats having to embrace new technologies. But I think it's very important to remember that foreign ministries are bureaucratic organizations. And the ability to embrace new technologies many times rests on an institutional perspective. So in order to adopt, whether we call it hybrid diplomacy, or maybe we should call it immersive diplomacy, in order to adopt these new technologies, foreign ministries will need to institutionalize them. And this means creating guidebooks, and even creating rules for diplomats using hybrid diplomacy. This might include, how does diplomatic protocol work in a virtual setting? What agreements can be reached online, and what agreements necessitate face-to-face meetings? Can diplomats attend recorded video sessions, because then everything is on the record and nothing is off the record? And we've seen that this phase of institutionalization was critical to diplomats embracing social media, to diplomats later embracing big data, to now diplomats embracing algorithmic approaches. And here again, terminology plays a very important part. Back in the day, the Finnish embassy would never call it digital diplomacy. They always called it diplomacy in the digital age. And their approach was, by using this terminology, the diplomacy has stayed the same, but we're just using a new set of tools. Other foreign ministries that called it digital diplomacy immediately started digital training, because their focus was on the digital aspect. So terminology will probably very much influence how foreign ministries institutionalize the use of hybrid diplomacy and how this bureaucratic system adapts. And I think that will be crucial for diplomats' ability to leverage these tools.
Yeah, just a final comment. I think what I found missing from that Wadley is the word creativity. I think this is interesting, right? Because it's, in order to excel, this is a medium, and this is a provocation, this is a challenge. So in order to be well, we have to think outside the box. This is why the people who, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs managed to do well on social media, they have to be creative. You have to push yourself. And I think with the virtual nowadays, we've seen, the rise of the digital, that was a creative element. That was something that people hadn't seen before. I think here is the creativity, how to make sure, not creativity for the sake of creativity, but for the creativity in the sense of thinking how to accomplish these goals that you set for yourself. I think this is the exciting part. These mediums are not exactly, and there is a tendency to treat them with the old attitudes, the old approaches, which is not necessarily, it's human. But at the same time, when you look at them, and for instance, in the survey that I've seen before, this element of non-verbal communication that came on the lips of many of the people in the survey was quite important, right? Non-verbal communication, how to read, how to engage with the other people. So there is a room for thinking more creatively, and I think that's something that I want people to reflect more on how this kind of new challenge, how this kind of what this new medium in terms of feature allows us diplomatically to be a bit more interesting in the way in which we accomplish our goals.
Thank you. I think this is an excellent note on which to end our debate. 3 things from my side. First thing, thank you to our excellent speakers. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and thank you again for taking the time. So we had Professor Cornelio Bjorla and Dr. Ilan Manor. Thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for the comments and questions. And with one eye, I see they're still coming, which brings me to my second point. As always, we will follow up this debate with a recording of the debate, which we will publish, and also a written summary. And then third point is kind of a sneak peek. In early September this year, we will organize a conference, a hybrid conference, most likely, on digital and diplomacy, kind of unpacking what has been happening over the last 1.5 years, but also kind of putting this in the larger context of conversations around digital technology and diplomatic practice. We haven't officially announced this yet, but stay tuned for that. Perhaps already kind of mark your calendars. With all that said, thanks again for everyone who joined today. It was an absolute pleasure. And as always, we will follow up to this web debate, and then this is also an opportunity for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katerina, and thank you very much for the people in the audience.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was excellent. I really enjoyed that. And if you want to, you can stay a bit longer. I think there's still comments and questions coming in. But I'm sure we will stay in touch on this on Twitter and other places.